December 16, 1944. If General George Smith Patton hadn't predicted what was coming, 200,000 United States soldiers would have been wiped out in the snow-covered forests of Belgium. Not wounded, not captured. Wiped out. While every other Allied commander sat comfortable in their headquarters, convinced the Germans were finished, one man saw the storm coming. They called him Old Blood and Guts, a name earned through years of leading from the front, charging into battle while other generals commanded from behind the lines. And on that freezing morning, everything George Smith Patton warned about came true. The German army smashed through the Ardennes forest with a fury the world hadn't seen since 1940. 24 German divisions, 200,000 men, hundreds of tanks. They tore through the United States defensive lines like a knife through paper. Entire American units surrounded, communications cut, supply lines severed. In 72 hours, Hitler's forces carved a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied territory. Commanders panicked. Soldiers froze to death in foxholes. The entire Western Front stood on the edge of collapse. But here's what nobody knew. 2 weeks before the attack, General George Smith Patton sat in his headquarters studying maps. His staff officers bustled around preparing for their own offensive into Germany. Patton wasn't looking at his offensive plans. He stared at the Ardennes, the quiet sector, the place where green United States divisions went to rest, the area every other general ignored. "They're coming through here," Patton said, tapping the map. His officers exchanged glances. Intelligence reports showed nothing. The Germans were retreating everywhere. Berlin was bombing its own cities with their last fuel. The war would be over by Christmas, everyone said. "Sir, there's no indication," his intelligence officer began. Patton cut him off. "I know the Germans. I know how they think. They're not finished. They're going to hit us here in the Ardennes, and they're going to hit us hard." The officer hesitated. "What should we prepare, sir?" "Everything," Old Blood and Guts replied. "We're going to stop whatever they throw at us, and then we're going to kill them all." They thought he was paranoid, battle-mad, too aggressive. George Smith Patton ignored them and ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans. 3 different plans, each one designed to wheel his entire Third Army 90 degrees north and strike into the German flank. He assigned code names. He calculated fuel requirements. He traced routes. His staff thought it was an academic exercise. Patton knew better. Then December 16th arrived. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, German artillery lit up the pre-dawn darkness. Thousands of shells screamed into United States positions. When the barrage lifted, Panzer tanks rolled forward through the fog. American units radioed for help. Then the radios went silent. By noon, Supreme Allied headquarters in Versailles finally understood. This wasn't a local counterattack. This was a massive German offensive aimed at Antwerp. If they reached the coast, they would split the Allied armies in half. Chaos consumed the headquarters. Generals shouted, aides ran, maps couldn't keep up with the German advance. The situation changed every hour, every minute, and it kept getting worse. Bradley talked about withdrawing. Eisenhower looked 10 years older. Nobody had a solution. Nobody except one man. General George Smith Patton stood calmly amid the panic, pearl-handled pistols on his hips, a slight smile on his face. Old Blood and Guts was about to change history. December 19th, 1944, the emergency conference at Verdun. Every senior Allied commander crammed into a cold, damp barracks room. The mood was funeral. Eisenhower opened the meeting with stark words. "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster." Nobody believed him, except George Smith Patton. "Hell, let's have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris," Patton said, grinning. "Then we'll really cut them off and chew them up." Other generals stared at him like he'd lost his mind. United States forces were retreating everywhere. The Germans controlled the roads. A critical road junction at Bastogne was about to fall, which would give Hitler a clear path west. And Old Blood and Guts was smiling? Eisenhower ignored Patton's bravado and pointed at the map. "George, I want you to move to Luxembourg and take command of the battle. When can you start?" The room fell silent. Everyone knew what Eisenhower was asking. Patton's Third Army was preparing to attack eastward into Germany. Now he needed to disengage from that battle, turn 90 degrees north, move over icy roads in the middle of winter, and counterattack into the German flank. The logistics alone were staggering. You couldn't just turn an army around like a car, moving hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, establishing new supply lines, coordinating with units you'd never worked with before. It would take weeks, maybe months. On December 22nd, Patton said immediately, with 3 divisions. The room erupted. Impossible, absurd, insane. General Omar Bradley, Patton's superior, looked embarrassed. Other commanders shook their heads. 3 divisions meant 75,000 men, thousands of trucks, hundreds of tanks. Move them 100 miles north in winter. Attack uphill into veteran German forces. In 72 hours? "Don't be fatuous, George," one British officer muttered. Patton's eyes went cold. "This has nothing to do with being fatuous, sir. I've already made my arrangements. 3 divisions on December 22nd. If you need me earlier, I can get 1 division there sooner, but it won't be as strong." The room stayed silent now. People realized George Smith Patton wasn't joking. He'd actually prepared for this. While everyone celebrated the march to Germany, while intelligence officers wrote reports about German collapse, while comfortable generals planned victory parades, Old Blood and Guts had war-gamed this exact scenario. He'd created the contingency plans. He'd briefed his commanders. He'd positioned his units. "Which divisions?" Eisenhower asked. "The 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry," Patton rattled off without hesitation. "I'll put the 4th Armored in the lead. They'll punch through to Bastogne." "Bastogne?" someone asked. The town was already surrounded by German forces. The American defenders there, the 101st Airborne Division, were trapped without supplies. Most commanders had written them off as lost. "Bastogne is the key," Patton said, striding to the map. "The Germans need it. Every road in the Ardennes runs through that town. If we hold Bastogne, we stop their advance. If we relieve Bastogne, we cut their offensive in half." "The 101st can't hold much longer," Bradley warned. "They're out of ammunition, out of medical supplies. They've got hundreds of wounded with no morphine. They're eating raw flour." "They'll hold," General George Smith Patton said with absolute certainty. "McAuliffe's got them. They'll hold until I get there." Eisenhower studied Patton carefully. Everyone in the room knew George Smith Patton was brilliant. They also knew he was reckless, impulsive, politically disastrous. He'd slapped shell-shocked soldiers. He'd made inflammatory speeches. He'd nearly been sent home in disgrace multiple times. But when you needed someone to attack, when you needed someone who never gave up, when you needed a killer, you called Old Blood and Guts. "All right, George," Eisenhower said. "The 22nd, 3 divisions. Get to Bastogne." Patton snapped a salute and strode out of the room, already barking orders to his staff. The other generals watched him go. Some shook their heads. Some muttered about Patton's arrogance. One British commander turned to Bradley. "Do you think he can actually do it?" Bradley sighed. "If anyone can, George can. But I don't see how. The roads are ice. The Germans own the air when the clouds break. Our troops are scattered and demoralized. It would take a miracle." What they didn't know was that General George Smith Patton had already set the miracle in motion. Before leaving for the Verdun conference, he'd called his headquarters from a Signal Corps truck. His chief of staff answered. "We're going north," Patton said simply. "Confirm Plan Orange." Plan Orange. The code name for the Ardennes contingency. His staff had been waiting for this moment. Within minutes, field phones rang across the 3rd Army. Commanders received sealed orders they'd been holding for 2 weeks. Unit movements began immediately. By the time Patton walked out of the Verdun conference, thousands of United States vehicles were already moving north through the darkness. But could Old Blood and Guts really pull it off? The next 72 hours would tell. The fate of 200,000 Allied soldiers depended on it. The outcome of the entire war hung in the balance. And one man carried the weight of it all on his shoulders. The man they called Old Blood and Guts. General George Smith Patton. And he was about to do the impossible. December 20th, 1944. 0:30. All across the 3rd Army sector, engines roared to life. Tank commanders buttoned up their turrets. Infantry climbed onto half-tracks. Artillery crews hitched their guns to trucks. The largest military movement in United States Army history began rolling north through freezing rain and darkness. The logistics were staggering. Patton's 3rd Army stretched across 150 miles of front. Now entire divisions had to disengage from combat with German forces to their front, execute a 90-degree turn, drive through one of the worst winters in decades, and immediately attack a different enemy in a completely different sector. It violated every rule of military science. It couldn't be done. George Smith Patton was doing it anyway. His staff worked with mechanical precision. Every plan Old Blood and Guts had forced them to prepare suddenly made sense. The fuel dumps positioned just right, the supply routes already mapped, the radio frequencies already coordinated. While other armies scrambled and improvised, Third Army executed pre-planned operations with the smoothness of a training exercise. But nature didn't care about plans. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Rain turned to sleet, then snow. Ice coated every road. Trucks skidded into ditches. Tanks threw tracks on frozen ruts. Soldiers, already exhausted from weeks of combat, now faced a winter march that tested human endurance to its limits. General George Smith Patton drove north in his command car, stopping constantly to check on his troops. His aide suggested he stay at headquarters and manage the movement by radio. Patton refused. Old Blood and Guts needed to be seen, needed to be with his men. That's how he led, always had, always would. At one checkpoint, he found a traffic jam. Dozens of trucks backed up at an icy crossroads, military police trying to sort out the mess, time bleeding away. Patton jumped out of his vehicle and started directing traffic himself. A 3-star general playing traffic cop. But it worked. The jam cleared. The trucks rolled. At another stop, he encountered a tank battalion halted by the roadside. The battalion commander explained that higher headquarters had ordered them to wait for fuel trucks. "Who ordered that?" Patton demanded. "Course, headquarters, sir. They said..." "Forget what they said. How much fuel do you have in your tanks right now?" "About half, sir, but regulations state..." "Regulations?" Patton's voice could cut steel. "You've got fuel? Then move. Get to Bastogne. You can refuel there after you kill some Germans." The battalion moved out immediately. That was George Smith Patton's method. Attack. Keep moving. Never stop. The enemy gets a vote in war, but you don't give him time to think. Meanwhile, at Bastogne, the situation deteriorated by the hour. The 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and other scattered units, held a shrinking perimeter around the town. German forces pressed from all sides. Panzer tanks probed for weak points. Artillery pounded the American positions day and night. On December 22nd, German commanders sent a surrender ultimatum to the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. The message demanded immediate surrender to avoid annihilation. McAuliffe's famous reply consisted of one word: nuts. When German officers asked for clarification, an American officer explained, "It means go to hell." The story of that defiant reply raced through United States forces. It reached George Smith Patton's headquarters by evening. Old Blood and Guts slammed his fist on the map table. "That's my kind of general. Now let's get to him." December 22nd arrived. Patton had promised Eisenhower he would attack on this date. Military experts said it couldn't be done. The roads were worse than predicted. The Germans were stronger than expected. Intelligence reports showed the 4th Panzer Grenadier Division blocking the direct route to Bastogne. But General George Smith Patton wasn't asking for opinions. He was giving orders. At 0600 hours, the attack began. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, smashed forward from the town of Arlon. Their objective: Bastogne, 25 miles north through enemy territory. Behind them, the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions attacked on parallel routes, widening the corridor and protecting the flanks. The fighting was immediate and brutal. German forces, surprised by the speed and violence of Patton's counterattack, nevertheless fought with desperate skill. They knew what the United States Third Army penetration meant for their offensive. Every mile Old Blood and Guts advanced put another nail in the coffin of Hitler's master plan. The 4th Armored crashed into German positions like an iron fist. Sherman tanks traded shots with German Panthers at point-blank range in frozen fields. Infantry cleared villages house by house. Artillery hammered enemy strong points. The advance measured in yards, then miles. But it wasn't fast enough. Not for Patton. "What's the holdup?" he demanded over the radio to Gaffey. "Why aren't you in Bastogne yet?" "Sir, we're facing determined resistance. The Germans..." "I don't want explanations, I want results. Get moving." Gaffey, a capable commander who'd served under Patton for years, knew his boss wasn't being unreasonable. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. He pushed everyone, himself hardest of all. The message was clear. Soldiers were dying in Bastogne. Every hour mattered. Move faster. Fight harder. No excuses. The weather added another enemy. Low clouds grounded Allied aircraft. That meant the vaunted United States air superiority, which had dominated German forces since D-Day, couldn't help. Patton's men fought without air cover, something that hadn't happened in months. The Germans, conversely, could move forces in daylight without fear of fighter bombers. But on December 23rd, the weather broke. A cold front pushed through, bringing crystal-clear skies. Eisenhower called it Patton's weather. Suddenly, hundreds of Allied aircraft filled the sky. Fighters strafed German columns, bombers plastered enemy positions. Most critically, transport planes began dropping supplies to the besieged defenders of Bastogne. General George Smith Patton stood outside his headquarters, watching the contrails overhead, and smiled. "That's more like it. Now we'll show these bastards what the United States Army can do." The German commanders watching from the other side felt very different emotions. They'd studied George Smith Patton for years. Erwin Rommel himself had called Patton the most dangerous Allied general. German intelligence tracked Old Blood and Guts constantly, knowing that wherever he attacked, the assault would be violent, unpredictable, and relentless. Now he was driving straight at their offensive's main artery, and he was moving impossibly fast. "How is this possible?" one German general asked his staff. "Third Army was 100 miles south 3 days ago. Now they're tearing through our flank. How did Patton do this?" Nobody had an answer. What they didn't know was that George Smith Patton had predicted their attack and prepared accordingly. While they planned in secret, Old Blood and Guts war-gamed their exact strategy. While they positioned forces, he positioned counter-forces. When they struck, they walked into a trap prepared by a military genius who thought 3 moves ahead. December 24th, Christmas Eve. The 4th Armored Division ground forward against savage resistance. Small towns became battlefields. Chaumont, Verdun, Hollange. Each one cost time, fuel, and blood. Inside Bastogne's perimeter, wounded soldiers lay in makeshift hospitals, wondering if relief would arrive before German tanks broke through. McAuliffe's paratroopers, surrounded and outnumbered, held their positions with the grim determination of men who refused to surrender. Patton spent Christmas Eve visiting frontline units. He moved from battalion to battalion, checking ammunition supplies, reviewing attack plans, encouraging commanders. His presence electrified troops. When word spread that Old Blood and Guts was personally overseeing the attack, soldiers fought harder. They believed in him. If George Smith Patton said they would reach Bastogne, they would reach Bastogne. Late on Christmas Eve, Patton knelt in a muddy field and prayed. His chaplain stood nearby. "Sir, I've prepared that prayer you requested, the prayer for good weather." "Good," Patton said. "But add something else. I want to thank God for this opportunity. Not many men get the chance to save an army." That was General George Smith Patton, confident to the point of arrogance, yet deeply spiritual. Aggressive beyond measure, yet thoughtful about the responsibility of command. Profane and sophisticated. Simple and complex. A walking contradiction who somehow made perfect sense when you saw him in action. December 25th, Christmas Day. Dawn broke cold and clear. Inside Bastogne, defenders prepared for what they knew would be a massive German assault. Outside the perimeter, panzer divisions massed for the killing blow. McAuliffe's men had fought magnificently, but everyone has a breaking point. The Germans planned to reach it today. Then, at 14:45 hours, soldiers in Bastogne's southern perimeter heard a new sound, different from the German guns. United States tanks, Sherman tanks, coming fast. The lead elements of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion crashed through German lines and linked up with defenders from the 101st Airborne. "Come on in," a paratrooper said to the tankers. "We've been waiting for you." The siege of Bastogne was broken. General George Smith Patton had done the impossible. He'd moved an entire army 90 degrees, covered 100 miles through winter, attacked uphill into veteran German forces, and punched through to relieve surrounded troops. All in exactly 9 days, just as he'd promised. Military historians would study this operation for generations. Soviet generals would analyze it, astonished at the speed and coordination. Even German officers, in prisoner interrogations, admitted grudging respect. "Only Patton could have done this," one captured German colonel said. "Your other generals are good." But Old Blood and Guts, he's one of us. He thinks like a Prussian. Attack, attack, always attack. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts. This is why the United States Army tolerated his indiscretions and outbursts. Because when it mattered most, when everything hung in the balance, General George Smith Patton delivered victory. December 26, 1944. The corridor to Bastogne remained narrow and vulnerable. German forces pressed from both sides, trying to cut the lifeline Patton had created. Old Blood and Guts wasn't interested in defense. He'd come north to attack, and attack he would. More divisions joined the battle. The 6th Armored, the 35th Infantry, the 97th Infantry. General George Smith Patton fed units into the meat grinder, widening the corridor, pushing the Germans back, turning their greatest offensive into their greatest defeat. The fighting reached an intensity few veterans had witnessed even in this terrible war. Villages changed hands multiple times in single days. Artillery from both sides turned forests into moonscapes. Tank battles erupted in snow-covered fields at dawn, leaving burning hulks as monuments to the violence. This wasn't the clean warfare of maneuver and strategy. This was close-quarters killing in frozen hell. Patton established his forward headquarters in Luxembourg City, close enough to the fighting that artillery fire sometimes rattled the windows. His staff urged him to stay farther back. Enemy fighters occasionally broke through. German special forces operated behind lines, but George Smith Patton refused. "How can I command from the rear? My men are fighting in the snow. The least I can do is hear the guns." Every morning he visited combat units, not safe rear area units, frontline rifle companies, tank battalions that had been in continuous combat for days. He'd arrive unannounced, pearl-handled pistols gleaming, and talk to soldiers, not speeches, conversations. He asked about ammunition, about food, about the enemy they faced. He listened, and then he'd move on, leaving behind troops who felt their commanding general actually gave a damn about them. The Germans launched counterattack after counterattack trying to isolate 3rd Army's spearhead. They threw elite SS Panzer divisions at Patton's flanks. They infiltrated special forces behind United States lines wearing American uniforms, trying to create chaos. They fought with the desperation of men who knew this offensive was Germany's last chance. If it failed, the war was over. General George Smith Patton responded with tactics that bewildered conventional military minds. When German forces concentrated to block his main advance, he attacked somewhere else. When they spread out to cover multiple approaches, he massed overwhelming force at one point and smashed through. He kept the enemy off balance, constantly guessing, never able to establish a stable defense. This was blitzkrieg in reverse, turned against its inventors by a master who'd studied their methods and improved upon them. "Patton fights like we do," one captured German tank commander admitted. "Fast, violent, never stopping. Most American generals are methodical, predictable, not him. Old Blood and Guts is more German than the Americans, more aggressive than the British. He should have been born in Prussia." The weather deteriorated again after Christmas. Heavy snow, limited visibility, roads became ice rinks. Normal armies would have slowed, dug in, waited for better conditions. General George Smith Patton saw opportunity. If his forces couldn't use air support, neither could the Germans. If roads were bad, his troops were trained to overcome obstacles. Attack. Keep attacking. Never give the enemy time to rest. By December 28th, the 3rd Army had pushed the Germans back 5 miles beyond Bastogne. By December 30th, 10 miles. The Bulge that had penetrated 50 miles into Allied territory began shrinking. Hitler's Grand Offensive, the operation that was supposed to split the Allies and change the war's outcome, collapsed under the weight of George Smith Patton's relentless aggression. But Old Blood and Guts wasn't satisfied with stopping the Germans. He wanted them destroyed. At a staff meeting on New Year's Eve, he outlined his vision. "We're not just pushing them back. We're going to cut them off, trap them, kill them all. I want to drive north and link up with Montgomery's forces coming south. Encircle every German soldier in the Bulge." His staff exchanged worried glances. Patton's plan was extraordinarily ambitious. It meant extending already stretched supply lines. It meant coordinating with British forces under Montgomery, and Patton hated Montgomery. It meant attacking through the worst terrain at the worst time of year. It risked everything on one massive gamble. "Sir," his chief of staff said carefully, Supreme Headquarters wants us to consolidate, strengthen our position. Bradley thinks, I don't care what Bradley thinks, Patton snapped. I don't care what Montgomery thinks. I care about killing Germans. That's what soldiers do. We kill the enemy. And right now, there are 50,000 Germans trapped in that bulge, and I'm going to make sure none of them get out. This was George Smith Patton at his most dangerous. Not to his own men, but to any enemy who stood in his way. Other generals calculated casualties and logistics. Old Blood and Guts calculated victory. How many enemy can we kill? How far can we advance? How badly can we damage them? Those were his metrics. Eisenhower, under political pressure to give British Field Marshal Montgomery a larger role, divided the command of the Bulge battle. Montgomery took control of United States forces north of the Bulge. Patton commanded the south. The plan was for coordinated attacks to pinch off the German penetration. Montgomery delayed. He wanted more preparation, more supplies, more reconnaissance. George Smith Patton attacked immediately. The contrast couldn't have been starker. British and northern United States forces moved cautiously. Third Army drove forward like a spear aimed at Germany's heart. The Germans, caught between methodical pressure from the north and violent assault from the south, began withdrawing. Not retreating in good order. Running. Abandoning equipment. Leaving wounded behind. By January 7, 1945, United States forces from north and south linked up near Houffalize. The Bulge was erased. German losses exceeded 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. They lost 600 tanks, 800 aircraft, irreplaceable equipment and experienced soldiers that Germany could never replace. The offensive that was supposed to win the war instead lost it. After the Battle of the Bulge, everyone knew Germany was finished. The only question was how long until surrender. And everyone knew who had turned the tide. Not Montgomery, despite his later claims. Not Bradley, despite his steady competence. General George Smith Patton, Old Blood and Guts, the general who predicted the attack, who prepared contingencies when everyone else relaxed, who moved his army faster than anyone thought possible, who relieved Bastogne, who turned defensive crisis into offensive victory. Patton is the most aggressive general we face, a captured German chief of staff told interrogators. If he commanded all Allied forces, you would have won the war months ago. Thank God you have other generals who are more cautious. That statement, more than any Allied praise, captured George Smith Patton's essence. His enemies feared him more than they feared anyone else. They tracked his movements obsessively. They knew his methods. They respected his skill, and they couldn't stop him. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. Over 600,000 American soldiers participated. Nearly 90,000 became casualties. Entire divisions were decimated. Towns were obliterated. The civilian population suffered terribly, but the outcome was never in doubt once George Smith Patton entered the battle. From the moment his Third Army turned north, the Germans faced inevitable defeat. After the battle, praise flooded in from unexpected sources. Eisenhower, who had clashed with Patton repeatedly over discipline and political matters, sent a personal letter. George, your role in the Bulge operation was magnificent. I can't say enough about the speed and efficiency with which you moved your army north. It was one of the most brilliant operations of the war. General Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior and frequent critic, wrote in his diary, I will never again doubt George's military judgment. What he accomplished in those 9 days defied everything I know about military science. He proved me wrong, and he saved thousands of American lives doing it. Even Winston Churchill, who generally preferred Montgomery over American commanders, admitted, Patton's movement to Bastogne was extraordinary. I doubt any British general could have matched such speed and aggression. But the most telling recognition came from the soldiers who fought under Old Blood and Guts. They'd cursed his demands for spit and polish even in combat zones. They'd resented his strict discipline and harsh punishments for minor infractions. They'd laughed at his pearl-handled pistols and grandiose speeches. But they'd also watched him deliver victory after victory. They'd seen him visit them under fire. They'd heard him praise their courage. And they knew, absolutely knew, that George Smith Patton would never waste their lives. He spent blood when necessary, but never carelessly, never without purpose. General Patton was a son of a bitch, one Third Army veteran said years later. But he was our son of a bitch. We'd have followed him anywhere. Hell, we did follow him everywhere. Sicily, France, Belgium, Germany, and we won every time because Old Blood and Guts knew how to fight. The Battle of the Bulge revealed fundamental truths about military leadership that remain relevant today. First, preparation matters. While other generals enjoyed comfortable assumptions about German collapse, George Smith Patton prepared for worst-case scenarios. When disaster struck, his preparations paid dividends no one else could match. The United States Military Academy at West Point still teaches his contingency planning methods. Second, speed is a weapon. Patton understood that in warfare, time matters as much as firepower. Getting there first, hitting the enemy before he's ready, maintaining relentless pressure. These advantages multiply combat power. His relief of Bastogne succeeded not because he had more troops or better equipment, but because he moved faster than anyone thought possible. Speed created surprise. Surprise created opportunity. Opportunity created victory. Third, aggressive spirit wins battles. The Germans launched their offensive expecting methodical Allied response. They calculated how long it would take for United States forces to react, regroup, and counterattack. Their estimates would have been correct facing most Allied commanders. But George Smith Patton wasn't most commanders. Old Blood and Guts didn't react, he counterattacked. He didn't regroup, he attacked while regrouping. He compressed the timeline so severely that German plans fell apart before they could mature. Fourth, leadership is personal. Patton led from the front. He shared danger with his troops. He made himself visible during crisis. Modern generals command from protected headquarters, managing operations through computer screens and radio nets. General George Smith Patton commanded from the front seat of a jeep, racing between combat units, personally solving problems, inspiring soldiers through his presence. That style cost him safety and comfort. It earned him loyalty and extraordinary performance. The Battle of the Bulge also demonstrated why the United States Army tolerated Patton's many flaws. He was politically tone-deaf. He made offensive statements. He'd slapped shell-shocked soldiers, causing a scandal that nearly ended his career. He feuded with other generals. He courted press attention inappropriately. He violated orders when he thought he knew better. Any one of these offenses would have finished most officers' careers. But George Smith Patton delivered victories nobody else could match. When the chips were down, when the situation looked hopeless, Old Blood and Guts found a way to win. After the Bulge, German forces retreated steadily eastward. Patton's Third Army led the pursuit, crossing the Rhine River, driving into the heart of Germany. He wanted to continue all the way to Berlin. Eisenhower stopped him, giving that objective to Soviet forces for political reasons. Patton raged against the decision, correctly predicting it would cause post-war problems. But even in Germany's collapse, even racing against Soviet forces, George Smith Patton maintained the aggressive spirit that defined his career. He reached Czechoslovakia. He reached Austria. He liberated concentration camps, witnessing horrors that hardened even his iron constitution. When victory in Europe finally arrived on May 8, 1945, Patton's Third Army had advanced farther, faster, and with fewer casualties than any comparable force. They'd liberated more territory, captured more prisoners, destroyed more enemy units. The statistics were staggering. In 10 months of continuous combat, Third Army inflicted over 1 million casualties on German forces while suffering 140,000 of their own. That's a 7-to-1 kill ratio, unheard of in modern warfare. "How did you do it?" a reporter asked General George Smith Patton after the war. "I didn't do it," Patton replied. "My soldiers did it. I just pointed them at the enemy and got out of their way." Then he grinned. "Well, maybe I helped a little, but those boys, those magnificent Americans, they did the fighting. They deserve every bit of credit." That modesty, rare for Patton, revealed another side of Old Blood and Guts. Beneath the bombast and profanity, beneath the pearl-handled pistols and theatrical speeches, lived a man who genuinely cared about his soldiers. He drove them hard because he believed in their potential. He demanded excellence because he knew they were capable of it. He never accepted excuses because he refused to let them settle for mediocrity. And when the battle was over, he gave them credit, taking none for himself. Why was General George Smith Patton the only general ready for the Battle of the Bulge? Because while others celebrated victories and planned parades, he studied the enemy. While others assumed the war was nearly won, he prepared for desperate German resistance. While others saw the Ardennes as a quiet sector, Old Blood and Guts saw vulnerability. He thought like his enemy. He predicted their moves, and when they struck, He was ready. This is the essence of military genius, not just fighting well when prepared. Anyone can do that. True genius means preparing for battles no one else expects. It means training your force to execute complex operations under terrible conditions. It means building the mental flexibility to abandon offensive operations and shift instantly to defensive crisis. General George Smith Patton possessed all these qualities in abundance. Modern military historians argue about his legacy. Some focus on his controversies. Others emphasize his victories. But everyone agrees on one point. When the situation required aggressive action, rapid movement, and violent offensive spirit, nobody matched George Smith Patton. Old Blood and Guts was simply the best attacking general the United States Army produced in World War II. The Battle of the Bulge proved this conclusively. December 16, 1944, could have been one of history's great disasters. A successful German offensive might have extended the war by months, cost tens of thousands more casualties, perhaps even forced negotiated peace that left Hitler in power. Instead, it became his final defeat. Not because of Allied air power, though that helped. Not because of Soviet pressure from the East, though that mattered, but because one general, one aggressive, profane, brilliant, impossible general, saw it coming and prepared to crush it. Today, the United States Army War College teaches the Battle of the Bulge as a case study in crisis response. They analyze Patton's contingency planning. They study his movement tables. They examine how he maintained command and control while executing one of military history's most complex operations. Students learn that preparation, speed, and aggressive action can overcome material disadvantage and tactical surprise. They learn these lessons from George Smith Patton's example. Veterans of the battle, growing fewer every year, remember it differently. They remember the cold, the fear, the desperate fighting, and they remember the moment when word spread, Third Army is coming, Patton is on his way. Old Blood and Guts never abandons his soldiers. Relief transformed exhausted defenders into renewed fighters. Surrounded troops held on just a little longer. Wounded soldiers found strength they didn't know they possessed, because they believed in him. General George Smith Patton had earned their faith through previous victories, and he validated that faith by doing the impossible once more. In Bastogne today, a monument stands to the defenders who held that critical town. Tourists visit by the thousands. They walk the foxholes. They tour the museum. They see McAuliffe's famous nuts reply. But the soldiers who fought there know the full story. They know that courage and defiance weren't enough. They know that without relief, they would have been overrun, and they know who brought that relief. The 4th Armored Division crashed through on December 26th because General George Smith Patton moved them 100 miles in 9 days through winter hell and ordered them forward regardless of cost. This is why they called him Old Blood and Guts, because he bled with his soldiers and demanded they show the guts to keep fighting, when lesser men would surrender. It wasn't a kind nickname, it wasn't meant to be. It was accurate. George Smith Patton shed blood, his own in World War I, his soldiers in World War II, and never flinched from the cost of victory. That hardness, that absolute refusal to accept defeat, made him difficult to serve under. It also made him the most effective combat commander of his generation. The Battle of the Bulge was George Smith Patton's finest moment, not because it was his biggest battle. Third Army fought larger engagements, not because it demonstrated new tactics. He'd used these methods before, but because it proved beyond any doubt, beyond all argument, that Old Blood and Guts possessed a strategic vision and operational excellence no other Allied general could match. He saw the threat coming, he prepared his response, and when disaster struck, he executed flawlessly under conditions that would have paralyzed most commanders. If you want to understand why the United States won World War II, study logistics, study industrial production, study Allied cooperation. But if you want to understand how individual battles were won, how desperate situations were reversed, how impossible missions succeeded, study General George Smith Patton. Study how he thought, how he planned, how he led, how he fought. Because Old Blood and Guts represents the warrior spirit at its finest, flawed, difficult, politically incorrect, but absolutely unstoppable in combat. The final word belongs to the soldiers of Bastogne. A paratrooper from the 101st Airborne, interviewed 50 years after the battle, said it best. We held that town because we were tough, because we were paratroopers, because we refused to surrender. But we'd have died there if Patton hadn't reached us. Old Blood and Guts saved our lives. He promised to come, and he came. That's all any soldier can ask from his general. Keep your promises and bring us home alive. George Smith Patton always kept his promises. And that's why they called him Old Blood and Guts. That's why the United States Army needed him. That's why military historians still study his campaigns. That's why even his enemies respected him. General George Smith Patton, the man who was ready when nobody else was, who moved when everyone said it was impossible, who saved an army because he refused to accept that it couldn't be done. This is his legacy. This is his monument. Not bronze statues or named buildings, but the memory of what one determined general accomplished when the stakes were highest and the odds were longest. The Battle of the Bulge, December 1944, when Old Blood and Guts proved he was, and always would be, the finest fighting general the United States ever produced. If this story of General George Smith Patton's impossible achievement moved you, hit subscribe. We're bringing you more untold stories from Old Blood and Guts and other legendary commanders who changed history through courage, brilliance, and unbreakable will. This is history's greatest warriors, and you're witnessing their finest hours.